fully autonomous utility platform. That's Sikorsky's line, but the interesting bit is the math behind it. 14 hours, 1,600 plus nautical miles, 4 JMICS inside, 9,000 pounds outside. We'll verify each figure and map them to mission design. How does tablet-driven matrix autonomy adjust routing with onboard cameras and sensors? How does fly-by-wire preserve control margins while removing the crude cockpit? By this point, the question isn't if it flies. It's what problems it can remove from your schedule. We'll start with range planning, then endurance, then payload trade-offs, so you can see the operational delta clearly. Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Everyone quotes over 1,600 nautical miles. But the useful question is what that does to staging math and how often you need to touch a hose. Range is not a trophy number. It is a routing tool that dictates where you can base, how you ladder fuel forward, and how many people you expose doing it. The baseline matters. A typical UH-60L plans around shorter legs with fuel at predictable intervals, and that drives crew duty limits, tanker placement, and the whole ritual of hot refuel, shutdown, and crew swap. Each stop is a schedule gate and a vulnerability, and it multiplies when weather forces detours or when the receiving point goes cold. So the claim that a derivative without a cockpit and with autonomy can self-deploy across a theater sounds tidy on a slide, but the field question is whether it can cut out the chase chain of Bowsers, cruise, and rest cycles. If the aircraft can stretch legs and keep the hook capability, then you are not just going farther, you are deleting stops. Lay out the variables. Self-deployment legs are a function of cruise profile, installed fuel, and reserve policy. Cruise speed and altitude trade fuel flow against time on the wing. And internal fuel options matter because removing cruise stations frees volume for auxiliary tanks without pushing max gross weight. That volume was previously occupied by seats, instrument panels, and crashworthy structure. It is now available to be fuel or cargo. And the control laws do not care who is sitting up front because there is no one up front. Against a standard Black Hawk, you keep a similar external lift envelope but change what happens inside the cabin and who manages the flight. The U-Hawk's additional internal volume edges out the land refuel crew rest cycle because operators schedule it from a ground node and do not observe crew rest gates. It was therefore possible to rethink staging around ground-centric control rather than pilot duty day. Matrix is the routing engine. You set mission goals on a tablet, and onboard cameras and sensors build a picture for terrain and obstacle avoidance, while the system replans around weather bands or threat rings. Think of it like a navigation app that not only finds a new road when a bridge is out, but also changes speed and altitude to save fuel when headwinds pick up. By way of example, take a logistics corridor from a coastal hub to a forward ammunition point deep in an island chain or across a desert belt. A conventional plan might step through 2 or 3 refuel points with a crew swap halfway. Here, 2 long legs close the distance with no intermediate crew change, and an operations cell in the TOC monitors health data, weather, and threat updates, and adjusts the route while the aircraft keeps moving. Quantify the delta in operational terms. Each removed refuel stop deletes a vulnerable point, a fuel truck, a pad crew, and a stack of consumables. The endurance margin that remains after the second leg becomes a divert option when the forward point goes red or the weather shelf drops. You trade a line of many small risks for fewer, better defended nodes. So, how far does it actually fly in practice? With over 1,600 nautical miles available for self-deployment, plus enough loiter to absorb ground delays, the aircraft pushes the usable theater edge outward while holding a 9,000-pound external hook. It is not a stunt profile. It is a staging pattern that strips out the pauses that usually break momentum on day 3 of a surge. Range moves the chessboard. Endurance decides how long you can hold a square. And we can now move on to what 14 hours does to ISR handoffs and convoy cover when the ground tempo refuses to stay on schedule. 14 hours sounds indulgent on a helicopter, but in contested logistics, it removes the weak links that usually snap first. Duty clocks, holding stacks, pop-up threats, and LZs that slip an hour or two are not edge cases. They are the routine. Endurance converts those from stop orders into nuisances because the aircraft keeps orbiting with fuel in hand while the ground team sorts the choke point. The crewed helicopter constraint is simple. People run out of legal duty time long before an airframe exhausts its fuel options, and every diversion to a holding stack burns minutes against both limits. Add a pop-up SA threat or a route closure and you push the crew up against rest rules just as the landing window opens, so you wave off and start the shuttle again. The effect is cumulative and it cascades as more aircraft stack into the same funnels. Long loiter only matters if the aircraft does useful work while it waits. That means it must carry more per sortie, change routes without a cockpit crew, and ride out exposure without eroding safety margins. The U-Hawk's cabin redesign addresses the first lever. Removing the cockpit returns roughly a quarter more internal space to payload use, and that space takes standard containers instead of bespoke pallets, which cuts loading time and reduces tie-down drama. With 25% more internal volume, 4J mix go in one lift rather than two, and odd-size loads that normally demand a second aircraft fit on the first try. That is the distinction between endurance as loiter theater and endurance as throughput. It is therefore not just about hours in the air. It is about tons per hour delivered into a narrow window. Edge cases make the point cleaner. A HIMARS 6 rocket pod stows internally, or two naval strike missiles slide into the same footprint with room for support gear. Launched effects racks ride along as distributed sensors or munitions, and they do not crowd out the primary cargo because the forward volume, once reserved for pilots and instruments, is now cargo or fuel. One way or another, the payload that used to require sequencing now rides together, and the aircraft holds orbit until the lane opens. Endurance ties back to payload because each extra container removed from the manifest deletes a sortie and the escort or deconfliction that went with it. 14 hours means the delivery window follows the ground tempo instead of forcing it. If a convoy drifts, the aircraft drifts with it and still has fuel to divert when the LZ goes cold or the weather ceiling collapses. You get fewer starts and stops and fewer times you must tell the ground element to reset for tomorrow. External lift continuity matters when the cabin is full of fuel or containers. The 9,000-pound hook remains, so the same sling loads stay on the menu. You keep the familiar rigging and pad procedures, and you decide case by case whether to shift weight inside or hang it outside. In any case, the option space widens, not narrows. Control authority is the other pillar. A third-generation, low-cost, fly-by-wire system sits under matrix autonomy, so stability and envelope protection live in software rather than in a pilot's wrists. The operator commands the aircraft from startup to shutdown on a tablet, and the autonomy stack builds and updates the flight plan with its own cameras, sensors, and algorithms. That removes the pilot from the loop without removing the safety margin, and it tolerates the kind of long, low-workload orbits that usually invite human error. So the payoff is concrete. Oversized internal loads such as 4 JMICS or missile pods ride in one go, and the aircraft waits, hours, not minutes, until the landing lane is clean. Throughput rises, exposure per ton falls, and the vulnerable moments compress into fewer, shorter episodes. By this point, the phrase is literal. Operators, not pilots, because the aircraft's job is to stay aloft, reroute, and deliver while people manage the clock from the ground. Endurance plus range turns a helicopter from a scheduled sortie into a persistent node. Fewer refuels, fewer crews at risk, more tonnage per flight hour because the aircraft waits, reroutes, and delivers while operators manage time from the ground. If you add the numbers, 1,600 plus nautical miles, 14 hours, 4 JMICS internal, 9,000 pounds external, you can start rewriting task organization. Subscribe if you want the cost curves, retrofit timeline, and counter air risk analysis next. The same autonomy stack bolts onto other airframes. The open question is which legacy platform gains the most when the cockpit becomes payload and operators, not pilots, run the mission.